Thank you. Order. If there are no further points of order, the clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Counter-Terrorism and Border Security Bill, second reading.
Now. Thank you. To move the second reading of the bill, I call, thank you, the Secretary of State for the Home Department, Secretary Sajid Javid.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that the bill be now read a second time. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this country faces significant threats to our national security. The first, the ongoing threat posed by terrorism to the safety and security of our communities and to the freedoms we cherish as a nation. And another is the threat posed by hostile state activity, which we saw most recently in Salisbury. As has been said many times before in this House, our police and our intelligence agencies are unwavering in their commitment to protecting us and keeping this country safe. They are ready to put their own lives on the line to help save others. It is because of this commitment and their professionalism that 25 Islamist terrorist attacks have been disrupted since 2013. 4 extreme right-wing plots have also been foiled since the Westminster attack. But as we know all too well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, there were 5 terrorist attacks last year. 36 people were murdered. There are many more who are still grieving or coming to terms with those life-changing injuries and as a result of these terrorist atrocities that took place in both London and Manchester. We owe it to these victims and the survivors to do our very best to prevent attacks like this from happening again. Of course, Mr. Deputy Speaker, as Home Secretary, I do not want to offer false hope. No Home Secretary can guarantee that there won't be another terrorist attack on their watch. It's impossible for me to promise that there won't be more grieving parents, partners and children because of some senseless act of terrorist violence in the future. But what I can do as Home Secretary is to take a long, hard, forensic look at the powers that are available to our police, the security services, the prosecutors and the judiciary and make sure that they have what they need. That they have the powers to tackle the evolving threat to the UK from terrorism and from hostile state activity. That they have the powers to keep the public safe and to protect our national security. That this is what is in this wide-ranging counter-terrorism and border security bill. It's what it's all about. It's about keeping the people of this country safe. I will.
I'm very grateful. He's mentioned wide-ranging. Isn't that absolutely the key thing? Wide-ranging and flexible, because those who wish this country and our fellow citizens ill are always trying to keep one step ahead of our rules and regulations. That's why it's important to have that flexibility to make sure that all of the tools that we need and our agents need are available to them.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, my honourable friend is, of course, absolutely right. And what he and others, other honourable members, will see from this bill is that much of this bill is about updating powers that already exist, but making sure that they reflect the modern age. So, for example, when I come on to some of the powers around internet and online content. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this important piece of legislation will allow the police and MI5 to disrupt threats earlier and to ensure that our laws reflect the modern use of the internet. It will change existing laws to manage terrorist offenders better, and it will allow more effective investigations. It will also give police more powers to investigate hostile state activity. Yes, of course.
My honourable friend may be aware that in the previous bill dealing with the same subject matter, I put down an amendment relating to terrorists who were coming from other countries and saying that effectively they should not be allowed back into this country and that measures should be taken. Now, I know that the Minister of State is aware of this. Don't want to go into it in detail, but during the committee stage, I am intending to put down an amendment regarding that, and I'd be grateful if it would be given careful consideration, because people are finding there are far too many people coming back into this country, relying on human rights legislation, and then being in the position of radicalising other people in the jails.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, first I know that my honourable friend has taken a great interest in these matters for many, many years. And anything he has to say on this issue, I will listen to carefully, and so will the Security Minister. And I look forward to seeing any amendments that he puts forward. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in March, we saw the attempted assassination in Salisbury of Sergei Skripal using a deadly nerve agent. This also put his daughter Yulia and Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey and many others in danger, including the brave men and women in the National Health Service and our frontline officers who did all they could at the scene in the weeks and months since, have continued to do so, and also have worked hard to save the Skripals. The attack was highly likely to be the work of the Russian state, a conclusion that is shared by many of our international partners. They joined the UK in demonstrating to the Russian government that such actions are undermining the rule of law, their actions that they take are undermining the rule of law and international norms, and they have serious consequences. But events in Salisbury are part of a pattern of behaviour by the Russian government. And the Russians are, of course, not alone in engaging in hostile activity that threatens our United Kingdom. So it's high time that we harden our defences against hostile state activity. I will first, then I will.
I'm very grateful. He's been very generous with his time. He's mentioned my constituent, Nick Bailey, who was the police officer at Salisbury. Wiltshire Police have been incredibly helpful to Nick and to his family, with whom I'm liaising. Can I ask my right honourable friend to confirm in the dispatch box that he, his department, and Wiltshire Police will continue to give Nick and his family all the support that they need, given the very unique circumstances of the incident and the ramifications that he and his family have had from it?
Mr. Deputy, I'm happy to give my honourable friend that assurance, and I think this whole House has commended Sergeant Nick Bailey in what he did and how he put himself in the line of danger, just doing his job, as I'm sure he would put it. But I'm happy to give that reassurance to my honourable friend that, of course, we will work with him through Wiltshire Police and others to make sure he gets all the support that he needs. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way. And given what he's saying about Russia's attempts to undermine our society and engage in very, very hostile acts such as the one in Salisbury, could he say a little bit about the allegations that we've heard over the weekend, particularly in the Observer, the Sunday Times and elsewhere, obviously about other Russian attempts to potentially undermine parliamentary democracy and our democracy in this country? What steps is he taking to work with other departments, notably the Treasury, DCMS, and of course the Security Service and others, to ensure that Russia isn't attempting to influence and carry out potentially illegal activities elsewhere?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman that the Cabinet Office, the department that's responsible for overseeing elections and looking at allegations of that type. I know that they are taking this issue seriously. I know they are also looking at intelligence and other information they're receiving alongside my department, but the two departments are working closely on this issue, and I would assure him that we are taking it very seriously indeed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, because of hostile state activity, that's why this bill provides new powers to stop, question, search and detain people at ports, airports and the Northern Ireland border to determine whether they are spies or engaged in some other type of hostile state activity. And if it's confirmed that someone is a spy, they can be refused entry, they can be deported, or other action can be taken against them. These powers will, of course, be subject to strict safeguards and robust oversight to assure that, of course, they are properly used at all times. I will. Yeah.
I thank my right honourable friend very much for giving way. Will he just confirm that this is also about reducing the risk to the UK's interests overseas from terrorism, as is the contest strategy?
Yes, I can confirm that to my honourable friend. This is the powers in this bill are designed there to help us being better protected against all types of terrorist threat, including terrorist threat from overseas, and of course from better protected against some hostile state activity. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the other provisions in the bill are about making sure that we can respond more effectively to the changing terrorist threat. Part of this is arresting, prosecuting and convicting terrorists and imprisoning them for longer, as well as a more vigorous management of those terrorists following their release from custody to prevent reoffending. The bill will enable us to do all of this, in part by closing gaps in a number of existing terrorism offences. Yes, I will.
To the Home Secretary, and before he goes too much further on, I just want to take him back to the issue of hostile states and the checks on UK borders, including the border between Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. Can he confirm what discussions he's had with the PSNI? And can he confirm that that's one of those areas where we talk about no border, frictionless as possible, but there are some checks that do need to be carried out in terms of national security and safety?
I can confirm to the honourable gentleman that the department, I myself haven't had a discussion directly with the PSNI on this, but the department has been discussing with our Northern Ireland counterparts, and I believe there have been discussions with the PSNI to make sure that the measures that we're taking here on the borders in particular have taken into account the needs of Northern Ireland. Mr. Deputy Speaker, in particular, the bill will help stop terrorists exploiting the internet. We know that terrorists are using the internet and social media to spew out vile propaganda and call on others to follow their murderous lead. We know that online platforms are being used to spread hate, and we know how this enables them to try and recruit more people to join their ranks. And we know that people are being rapidly radicalised via the web. That's why this counter-terrorism bill includes measures to combat what's happening online as well as offline. For instance, the bill will make it a criminal offence to display a terrorist flag online in the same way that it is already a criminal offence to march down the high street waving one to show your support for a terrorist organisation. Provisions in the bill will also make it easier to tackle those who stream or repeatedly view extremist material online. At the moment, if someone downloads a bomb-making video, for example, from the internet, they are committing a criminal offence. However, if they watch the same video by streaming it, then they could escape prosecution. This, of course, isn't right. The bill also criminalises the repeated viewing of streaming of terrorist material online. This will close the loophole that allows some people to watch gruesome propaganda without any fear of prosecution. The bill will mean that people who repeatedly view terrorist content online could face up to 15 years behind bars. Yes, of course.
The Home Secretary giving way, he will know that I share his strong belief in taking strong action against the terrorist threat. But I'm just concerned about the wording on this clause and some of the others. So would this apply, for example, if I stream or look on YouTube at a national action video in the action that the Select Committee has been taking in order to try and get that video removed, if we watch it in the process of pursuing and pressurising YouTube to get it taken down, does that mean we are guilty of a criminal offence if we watch it more than 3 times? And I can tell the Home Secretary that they certainly left it up there for rather more than 3 times and forced us to watch it.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it's an important question from the Chair of the Select Committee, and so I want to be clear in my response. In such circumstances as she described, it would not apply. The objective clearly is to find and punish those that have terrorist intent. And there will be a reasonable excuse defence, as there is in other laws, for those that have a legitimate use, be it, for example, the Right Honourable Lady shared one example with us, but perhaps it could apply to academics, to journalists, to news organisations, and so that kind of a defence will clearly exist in the clause. I'll give way to the Honourable Gentleman. Yeah.
That's that point. I mean, on my more frank point of fact, I actually support many of these measures. But can I ask why 3? And I accept the definition in terms of academic research or journalist, or in case the Home Affairs Select Committee. What happens, for example, a teenager or somebody who's perhaps got mental health problems or other things, who actually watches it more than 3 times? Do they fall into automatically the category? Is that reasonableness test still there then?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I can tell the honourable gentleman, I think the objective here is to allow for the fact it's quite possible that someone could just accidentally come across such a video. They could be curious and watch it the first time, perhaps the second time. And I'm not pretending, I'm not standing here saying there's something magical about 3. It is an attempt to try and capture repeated viewing, which may then suggest that their intent in any way is not innocent. Of course, if someone was going to be prosecuted under this law, should this bill become an Act of Parliament, then that decision would be made by the evidence from the police working with the CPS, and of course, as in other sort of criminal offences of this type, the CPS would use judgment to decide whether it's in the public interest to actually prosecute. I'll give way one more time.
Why 3, and whether or not these have always got to be done in context, for example, because clearly if it's a pattern of somebody's behaviour that they're not watching one video 3 times, but a series of different types of videos, that's perhaps different. But I think if we're not careful, some of the people who are opponents of this bill will highlight this, that anyone who watches it 3 times is necessarily going to get prosecuted on it, which I know is not his intention.
Yeah. And Mr. Deputy Speaker, the honourable gentleman is right to make that point. People have already, some people have already said, made similar comments, but where I think that would be incorrect is that clearly that's not the intention of the law, and there are safeguards in place. But I welcome his overall support for the bill, but that's why I think it's important to debate these issues and for Parliament to come to a collective decision on this. And I think that it is something where I'm quite open to Parliament's ideas from parliamentarians, perhaps in the committee stage, to look more closely at these provisions and make sure we've got the balance right. Yes.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way, and I can tell him that he has my wholehearted support in bringing this bill forward. It's one thing to go after the people that are looking at this terrorist material online. It's another thing under Clause 4 to go after the people who are publishing it online. But surely what we really need to do is get it offline as quickly as possible. Will this bill do anything to be able to shut down the internet providers that actually allow it to be put online?
Mr. Deputy Speaker, I'll give 2 responses to that to my honourable friend. First, he may know that separately the Secretary of State for Digital Culture, Media and Sport is looking at the whole issue of internet safety and potentially legislation, something I'm sure he will discuss with the House at the right time. Secondly, I actually, just last week, I was in Silicon Valley meeting with all the really large internet companies, the big communications companies in the world, and recognizing that they have done a lot, especially in the last year, to remove terrorist content, but there's still a lot more that can be done. And so, outside of this bill, those efforts will continue. And I do hope that with the meetings that I've had with them and the US Homeland Security, the Homeland Secretary had with them, that we will be able to announce in due course further measures that those companies will take to do just that. I'll give way to the honourable lady first, then I will come back. Thank you.
The Home Secretary has been generous. But can you confirm, this bill obviously talks about making it illegal to watch the streaming of the offence of this material. Is it definitely an offence for, be it YouTube or any of these platforms, to stream terrorist material?
It is not an offence for the internet companies to stream the material. Not currently, not under UK law, and that is not, this bill does not impact on that. That said, as I've just mentioned a moment to my honourable friend, is that separately the government, led through DCMS, is looking at what other further measures may need to be taken for internet safety. I'll give way.
If you're giving way, it's very generous.
The Home Secretary mentioned that social media providers have taken lots of action, but it's my understanding that the Metropolitan Police have asked for 400 videos to be taken off YouTube that are essentially about incitement to violence. Is this bill not an appropriate vehicle to provide a power for all police authorities to compel social media providers to take down videos that are about incitement to violence?
Home Secretary. Yeah. Well, first, I believe that I think the honourable gentleman mentioned YouTube there, and I think, if I remember the number correctly, that they have removed something like 300,000 pieces of terrorist material. But there's still a lot more that needs to be done, not just by YouTube, but many of the other internet companies. Already there exists the ability for either the government or more likely through the police or other trusted organisations to flag certain content on the internet, whether that's videos or stills or other type of content. And what we are seeing at the moment that's really so far this year is a marked improvement in the speed at which that content is being taken down. In some cases, in many cases, within the hour it's been taken down. And the honourable gentleman may also be interested. What has also grown considerably in taking down content is the use of machine learning. And so trying to have the right algorithms to take content down much more quickly. And I will give way in a second, but he may be interested to know for Facebook, for example, that for the first quarter of this year, they've removed some 1.9 million pieces of content, which is up some 70% on the same quarter as last year. And in many cases, the content is being removed within minutes. And in some cases, it is being removed even before it's uploaded. I'll give way.
Giving way. Further to the point that my honourable friend made, I was very concerned to hear when these companies appeared before us in the Home Affairs Select Committee that they were not routinely searching for even the basic list of all prescribed organisations. Now, I accept that some of the stuff is quite grey territory, sometimes it's not going to be picked up by machine learning, but one would expect at a very basic level they would be searching for the names of prescribed organisations. I found multiple examples of content, including of Northern Irish terrorist organisations and others on all these platforms, which is not even being removed by the most basic checks. Why can we not compel them to do this?
I think again, the honourable gentleman makes another good point in this debate, in that I think he's right to say that many of the leading internet organisations, they weren't searching for the prescribed organisations, or certainly not all of them. Again, I think that in the last, so far this year, certainly there's been a significant improvement in that. It is something that we are monitoring ourselves, and we're in constant dialogue with those companies. I'm not going to pretend here that I think that every single one of them is doing that now, but I think there's a huge improvement in this. I'll give way to the right honourable gentleman. Yeah.
Home Secretary, I'm slightly confused about the government's direction of travel here. I think there's quite wide support across the House for action against the people who are publishing this material to get it before it's up there. And clearly the government is looking at that, and I think if the government comes forward with measures, they would get a welcome. Whereas the Home Secretary said himself, the government isn't sure about the legislation that's even in this bill, that the 3 clicks approach is right because it could catch innocent people. Would it not be more advisable to focus on what it would actually work, would solve the problem at root cause, and get support across the House?
Can I say to the right honourable gentleman, I mean, first, just to be absolutely clear, I think what he's referred to as the 3 clicks approach, or let's say the multiple viewing approach, it is absolutely the right approach. That's why it's in this bill. And from the discussions that I've already had and the Security Minister with colleagues across the House, I think it commands a wide body of support in this House, and of course it will be tested during the passage of this bill. The sort of wider issues of internet regulation, and not just applying to potentially to terrorist content, but to child sexual exploitation, to serious violence, gang violence, and issues of that type. That is something that these issues taken together, these kind of harms collectively from internet content, some internet content, is something that is being looked at by the Culture Secretary, and I believe there's a consultation going on at the moment, but that's the right place to look at this, because that kind of regulation, like the Right Honourable Gentleman has just seemed to be suggesting, is not part of this bill.
Am I right?
Now, yes, I will.
I am really sorry to labour this point with my right honourable friend, but I think it's one of the most critical aspects of defeating terrorism today is to get this content off the internet as quickly as possible, and surely the voluntary approach is better than a legislative approach. So can my right honourable friend give the House any information from his private meetings with the internet companies? Because after all, the Google and Facebook and others have some of the cleverest IT writers on the planet. Surely they ought to be able to take this stuff down before it gets almost noticed by anybody.
Well, as my honourable friend knows, as I've referred to already in the House, last week I met with all the companies he's just mentioned and others, and this was the only topic that we discussed. It was very focused on terrorist content on the internet. He's right to point out through your voluntary action and persuasion, there has been a lot that's already been achieved. All these companies understand that legislation is something that has not been ruled out. He asked me to perhaps say a bit more about some of the newer work these companies are doing. I hesitate to do that because I think we should announce that kind of thing at the right time, because it requires international coordination. But there is a lot more work. But what I will say, there's a lot more effort going into both machine learning and also the use of artificial intelligence to help to deal with this very important issue. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I must go on. There are a number of members that wish to speak in this debate. The bill also extends the ability of police and prosecutors to bring charges for terrorist offences that are committed overseas. It is not for law enforcement agencies in this country, of course, to police the world. But if someone travels from the UK and they commit a terrorist offence abroad, it is right that they are brought to justice if they return here. This is already the case for many terrorist offences, but there are a few gaps in the coverage, and that's why this bill extends the jurisdiction of the UK courts to cover further terrorist offences that are committed abroad, including the dissemination of terrorist publications and the possession of explosives for the purposes of an act of terrorism. I will.
Home Secretary very much for giving way. Why has he decided not to include the Australian scheme, the declared areas offence, whereby Australia deemed it illegal to travel to certain designated terror hotspots like Iraq and Syria? I know it's something that his minister has been looking at for some time, yet it is not part of the counter-terror bill put before the House today.
I can tell the honourable gentleman that that I think he'd call it the Australian type sort of extraterritorial offence that they've created. I am looking at just that, and there's a bit more work to do on it. It's not as straightforward as it might sound. Obviously, if it is brought forward as a legislative proposal, I want to make sure that we have looked at it properly, and if it's something that I'm persuaded by and can complete the work on in time, I intend to bring it forward potentially as a government amendment to this bill. Yeah.
I thank the Home Secretary for giving way, and he has my support in the thrust of this bill. But in terms of matters like the one that's just been raised in that intervention, would you reassure me that he'd be very much looking to ensure there was exemptions and defences around quite legitimate purposes? So, for example, we didn't get into arguments about whether an aid worker had crossed a particular line when they were there on matters that none of us would view should be criminal.
Yes, I can absolutely give my honourable friend that assurance. As with many of these types of measures, there's always the need to consider what I would call like a reasonable excuse defence. Now, Mr. Deputy Speaker, once we have brought terrorists to justice and secured their conviction by a jury, we want to make sure that the public are protected by locking up the terrorist offenders for longer and allowing more robust supervision on their release. The punishment for terrorists must properly reflect the severity of their crime. That's why the bill allows for the introduction of longer sentences of up to 15 years for a number of offences, including the collecting of terrorist information, encouragement of terrorism, and decimation of terrorist publications. Previously, the maximum sentence was up to 10 years for these kinds of offences, but as well as increasing the maximum length of sentences, we need to ensure that terrorist offenders are not released from custody until it is safe to do so. When they are released, they need to be subject to longer periods of supervision on licence. The bill achieves this by enabling the courts to impose a public protection sentence for a wider range of terrorism offences. This means that offenders will not be released automatically at the halfway point of their sentence, but will instead stay in prison until the parole board decides to release them. We are also extending sentencing provisions to Northern Ireland that already operate in the rest of the United Kingdom. I know that the level of sentences that have been handed down by the courts in Northern Ireland has been of particular concern to some honourable members, and this bill will help to address this. The bill will also make it easier to monitor terrorist offenders once they have been released by requiring them to notify the police of their bank or passport details and any vehicles that they may possess or have access to. I'll give way here.
The Home Secretary again giving way, and I support the measures which he's outlining. And in, I think, his briefing documents he sent prior to this, he referred to it being similar to sex offenders monitoring in the community. In those cases, there's clear joint working between the probation service and police at local level. Is he envisaging a similar type of system for monitoring those that have been convicted of terrorism offences?
Yes, Mr Deputy Speaker, I am. And finally, Mr Deputy Speaker, the bill will update the law relating to terrorism reinsurance. The attack last year on Borough Market highlighted a gap in the current arrangements which the bill now addresses. And I want to, in particular, thank the Honourable Member for Bermondsey and Old Southwark for the important work that he has done on this issue on behalf of his constituents. Mr Deputy Speaker, next Tuesday will mark the anniversary of the attack outside the Finsbury Park Islamic Centre last year. Our thoughts are with the family and friends of Mr Makram Ali, who died on that day a year ago. Just as they are with the victims and the survivors of other attacks last year in Westminster, in the Manchester Arena, in London Bridge and Parsons Green. We cannot turn back the clock to undo what has been done in those 5 attacks. But we can and we must learn the lessons and do everything in our power to prevent such suffering from being inflicted ever again. This bill plays an important part in ensuring that this House does just this. I commend it to the House.
The question is